Let's talk about Aristotle. Okay, so Aristotle is going to be a huge groundbreaking figure in the history of philosophy as well. And as you can see here, he stands beside, most of the time, what do we think of philosophy? He stands beside Plato and Socrates. If you can't tell, that is right down here. Socrates, and we've got Platon, and then Aristoteles. My Greek again, pronunciation probably needs some work, but these three are what I like to call anyway, the big three. They are really the three figures that establish, as it were, philosophy. Now, as I mentioned before, people like Whitehead or Russell or anyone who says that perhaps Plato, that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, I feel like completely miss how unique, just how important, just how big of a difference Aristotle made to this discipline, meta-discipline, as we've said. And without him, I don't think we'd have a philosophy that truly works in the way that it does today. So to me, all three of these figures are uber, ultra important. And Socrates, yes, taught Plato, who then taught Aristotle, and there's this sense of lineage. But without these three figures, Western philosophy would not be what it is, hands down. Now, why give so much importance to, say, Aristotle and not his disciples per se, or not the people who come after this point in history? Why end with the big three? Why isn't there like a big four or such? You know, some people have heard of Epicurus and others, and these are now really actually commonly popular philosophers for people to enjoy and appreciate. We're going to talk more about Epicurus and other such philosophers next time, but there really is hands down no way, in my view, to compare the amount of influence and the level of rigor in thought that these three implemented, and the radical change that they were making to thought itself at the time that they appeared on the scene. Aristotle in particular is going to do something that neither of these other figures so far have done. Neither Socrates nor Plato, as much as they embraced the love of wisdom and philosophy, as much as they brought about new ways of thinking about the world through philosophy. Aristotle is the first figure who really tries to systematize philosophy. Now, in Gaarder's book, he mentions how he kind of characterizes Aristotle and Sophie accordingly, who is now influenced by each of the philosophers as she gets to them, as being this ultra organizer and such. Indeed, he makes these categories by which the rest of the world can start to be framed. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Let's tend to one thing at a time. This, by the way, is not a very famous picture or famous painting, I don't think. I have never seen or heard it before outside of a very select number of websites that show this. I think it's absolutely wonderful, though, to see the three of them together, as they should be seen, in my view, together. All right, so you might recognize this. This is a very famous scene. This is possibly the most famous painting of Aristotle and his teacher Plato right next to him from the School of Athens, part of this giant fresco painted by Raphael back in the Renaissance. And you can see Aristotle to the right. He is a bit younger than Plato, and he is holding a book, which we can only see the E-T-I-C. That would probably be Etica or something. The Ethics. This probably is referring to the Nicomachean Ethics, which we'll say more on a little bit later, but basically his main book of ethics. To the left, you see Plato holding the Timeo or Timeo, where many of his ideas of abstract forms and the ideas that we talked about last time, where those were developed, where they got really, really well developed. And there's so many cool things. You'll notice in the painting how Raphael has depicted. Remember Socrates? Do you remember how Socrates was in nearly every one of those death scenes, with the exception of the last one? Socrates, one of his hands seems to be held upwards towards the sky, as if to talk about something above this world or beyond this world, and one hand towards the world itself, including the cup from which he drinks the hemlock. One world here, one world there. One gesturing upwards and one gesturing downwards. Here, one of their hands, each of them, is occupied by a book, and the other hand is doing that raising and that lowering instead. And Plato naturally is the one who's going to be talking about, in his participation of the forms and ideas, beckoning for us to think about transcendentalism, the idea of things being beyond this world. Now, I won't go into length on this word transcendentalism, but it really is important to understand in order to at least get the gist of before we tackle Aristotle. Transcendentalism. And I'll just keep it a transcendental. Put an ism at the end. Transcendentalism. To be transcendental in the context of philosophy means that something goes a step beyond or a level beyond the forms that are here in front of us. It goes to a level beyond what is immediately accessible to the senses. This term has been appropriated by people in mathematics, for instance. You'll notice there are irrational numbers like the square root of 2 and such, but there are transcendental numbers like pi that take on a whole nother level, as it were, of abstractionism. Transcendentalism does this. This is the world of Plato. The forms, the ideas, everything is in the world of the purely abstract, so beyond that we can only access it by way of mind, hence his adherence to rationalism, as those like Parmenides and Pythagoras were also adhering to. Now, what about Aristotle? Aristotle is different. Aristotle is very different. If Plato is beckoning to the transcendental realm of the forms, Aristotle is asking us to instead consider the almost direct opposite. Consider instead forms as they are here in the world among us. They are us. This that you see, experience, and such, this is where the forms live, as it were. And this is easy enough to depict by thinking about the problem of Plato's forms. See, if you remember last time, we were talking about, for instance, there's in Plato's world, we can say there's a form for human beings, there's a form for dogs, there's a form for chairs, and I suppose mouses. They wouldn't have existed back then, so we have to assume that every form that will exist in the future will eventually give way to a material version of that form as well. We also have to remember that the Greeks were commonly thinking that the world was static and not changing as much as we can see it clearly does over the course of history. So maybe this would have been a moot point at the time. But in any case, these forms, in their abstractness, were they would be limited, right? Remember how I said underline the word limited. There are a limited number of forms. There would, in a sense, have to be. Well, we've got a problem here, a very strict problem when it comes to Plato's forms. And the best way I like to depict it is with the puppy problem, I call it. The puppy problem goes like this. You have a dog, right? And let's just buy into Plato's ideas for a while, his forms, and say there's the form of dog. So there's some perfect cookie-cutter form of dog, and all other dogs are some material, less perfect, imperfect version of that ultimate form. Fine. But then you've got the puppy. So the puppy is fairly different from the dog. It's much smaller. It has different needs. It drinks milk. The dog, once it grows up, does not drink milk, or at least no dog I've met drinks milk. It's not common for a dog to drink milk once it's matured. So it also, is still developing its teeth, still developing in certain types of dogs or breeds of dogs the ability to hunt and smell well and so forth. It's different. How do you explain the puppy? So is it that there's a perfect form for dog and then imperfect forms, such as with puppies, there's the perfect form of dog and then imperfect dogs in the world, but then you have puppies somehow not quite yet developing into that form? Or how does that work exactly? How does it allow not just for some, how does it allow for the sort of change that Plato does seem to be saying, yes, is in a way there, but of course for him in reality things don't change. There's a very Parmenidean view here that the ultimate reality is a changeless one unity. The changing things are mostly an illusion, but it's an imperfection, to say the least, from the reality of being, of things being changeless and eternal, the eternal forms, right? So this is really hard to accommodate. And then take it to the next level. What about not just puppies and dogs? What about we take another really frequently commented animal in the realm of metamorphosis? What about, moths and butterflies, or tadpoles and frogs? Those are almost different creatures. If you didn't already know that a tadpole develops into a frog, you'd probably think they were separate animals. Same with caterpillars and butterflies. I think I said moths a moment ago. Caterpillars and moths / caterpillars and butterflies. You'd think they were completely different animals. And in some sense, they almost are. So how do we accommodate that, the immature and the mature form? Aristotle has a way of accommodating it. He says, well, no. First of all, the forms are not out there. The forms are of this world. Come back to here. Recognize that the forms are, as it were, require matter. Now, to talk about this more at length, we have to understand what he means by categorical universals. If for Plato, these forms are abstract objects, transcendental objects beyond this world, for Aristotle, the forms are really more of almost like a mental construct, a way that we can talk about the world, but not something with which the world, as it were, operates. Not some like magic principle, I'm using magic roughly there, and that sounds a little derogatory, but some principle out there that somehow executes itself on us down here. That's not Aristotelian. For him, form and substance are both necessary in order for being to exist. Okay, let's back up for a second, because that's a mouthful, and it's not clear what maybe I mean by that. There's this Greek word ousia, or just ousia. Again, I don't claim to know how to pronounce it perfectly, but the Greek word ousia is ousia is what is being referred to when we're talking about being. What do I mean being, though? This is the problem. Being and becoming. This is what those like Plato are trying to tackle. And this is one of our hugest, let's call it verses maybe, because it does tend to seem a little antagonistic. Versus becoming. This is one of our first big philosophical problems about the world. And we can say that the pre-Socratics, Thales, definitely Heraclitus, Parmenides, they were dealing with this problem of being and becoming. Over here, you've got being. You've got things as are, what they are. And Parmenides wishes us to think, and to say that something changes is to say it at once can be in the same moment, by some means, itself and then not itself, and you get a contradiction. And so becoming is not possible, only being is possible. Heraclitus, on the other hand, goes, no. Our senses tell us more or less the right thing, that all it is becoming. The river changes every single time we step into it, and we change every time we step into it. So the Eleatics, Parmenides, part of how they tackle this problem of being too is they try to say there's not even a difference between things. And in some sense, you can imagine like a unity, an absolute unity, what we'll call later a monism. More on that another time. That is, all things are in a sense one. And those like Heraclitus and Democritus and Empedocles and others see this as this becoming as possible in the first place, because there are many many things in the world. Pluralism, a plurality of things in the world. And you can even go as far for some of them as an infinite plurality, that there's an infinite number of things in the world and so forth. So this also brings up another important distinction. Again, a huge philosophical problem, the one versus the many. The one versus the many. You maybe recall this question being asked of you earlier. Is there only one thing? Is really the universe just one thing of which we're all parts, but all composing and constituting this oneness? Is one way to think of this question. Or are we infinite, or if not infinite, finite or infinite, just plural in our beings? Plural in the number of ways one can be in the world or take part in the world. Plato tackles this visa, this being, by saying that it is to be found in some sense in the eidos. I think I even pronounced it eidos last time. The eidos, the forms, the ideas. In a way, what he's saying is that while there is in some sense a becoming, it's an imperfect becoming that trends toward, that is just a derivation of the perfection of the one, of the eternal, of the visa of ideas or forms or eidos. So the visa, or the being, is the essence, not just being itself, but essence, the essence of being. We're going to see that the way I characterize now Aristotle is a little bit different than the way he may have been characterized in Gaarder, because I think Gaarder actually makes a small misstep here. So what does Aristotle do differently? Okay, Aristotle creates this, he starts this idea, he comes up with an idea that we now call hylomorphism. Another big fancy word. But let's break this one down too. This is important for us to understand what he's doing that's so fundamentally different from Plato. Hylo comes from the word hule, again, probably mispronouncing that, which just means something along the lines of material. This is the part that I feel that Gaarder, accidentally or mistakenly anyway, translates as substance, but more on that in a second. The other word is morphe. And as you can maybe guess, morphe means form. It sounds like it means to change, but really what we're talking about is we're talking about morphology, we're talking about morphing, we're talking actually about changing of form in those cases. Form or morphe. Form, morphe as form. That is what this is about. And so what is being done here is Aristotle is taking the idea of form. Notice not the same idea, not form in the same sense as Plato. Plato called this eidos, the ideas, what we also will call the forms of things through the ideas. He's not referring to eidos here, he's referring to morphe. He's saying form is something altogether different from what Plato is talking about. Now, he was a star student of Plato's for the longest time, probably more likely deserved to take over Plato's academy when Plato passed away and instead got ousted, and that it was taken over by someone else. Started his own school, the Lyceum, and from this point he's really trying to demonstrate how Plato, not out of unkindness, but just out of the need for progress, as we saw the scientists do before this, questioning the teacher's even most basic fundamental concept of form, so fundamental to Plato. He's saying, no, it's morphe. It's not eidos, it's morphe. Form is something that we must pair with material, which Gaarder calls substance in the book, but we're going to call it material here because you'll see why in a second. And with material and form, we get things. We get visa. We get the being of things. So if things be, if things are being, if their visa requires material, or hule, and morphe, form, then if visa depends on this, then this has two implications. First of all, he says material and form are just ideas of our own. We can talk about them logically this way. We can kind of see the difference between form and material. However, in reality, in the things themselves, in the substance, that is the stuff of reality, we need both. We need form and material, but we are the ones who make the distinction. They are inseparable from each other. You can't have material without form. You can't have form without material. Try this as a thought experiment. Imagine, and a lot of the time we want to say matter. We'll come back to the idea of matter if there's time later. But material. Imagine something as simple as, I'll take this eraser for a moment because it's on my desk. It's here. So the eraser is a square eraser, and it's made of, I assume, some sort of polyester type material, or maybe a nylon or something. Nah, I don't know what that would be. Some fiber. But imagine the fibers of this being without form. You might say, well, that's easy, Kelsey. Just tear the thing apart until all the fibers are... Yeah, but then the fibers themselves have form. The fibers themselves, you would expect strands. You wouldn't expect little shapes of kitty cats, right? Fiber kitty cat. That would be weird. And even then, if they did show up that way, it would still be a form, be in the morphe or form of cats. So you cannot imagine material or matter without form, I will bet. If you just imagine an endless stretching sheet of rubber, I bet you anything, you're still imagining it as being a thin sheet of rubber. You've got a sheet that is form. And you imagine that even though you say it goes infinitely, that you cannot actually capture in your mind infinity. No offense. I can't either. So we can't imagine material without form. Likewise, how can we understand form without material? You know, a square is great, but, you know, there is no version of a square that I can experience that isn't made of fiber, or made of pixels on my computer screen, or made by marker or pencil shavings as I draw it. There's no form. Even if I access it in my mind, I see color. I see a black line figure for a square that's probably mostly the result of all the experiences of square I've seen in textbooks and drawn myself. I cannot get at form without some version of material. And he says, while we can tear these apart in our minds, we have to recognize that they are inseparable in things themselves. Although I use that word very colloquially here. That has a specific meaning in philosophy, like I said before. We'll get to that another time. Why is this different from what Gaarder said? Because if substance in itself is the fundamental entity, stuff of reality, the essence, the ousia, then Aristotle is saying that ousia, that is being itself. You know, he's obviously allowing for becoming here, as we'll see. But being itself requires those two things, the morphe and the hule, the material and the form. We have to have those for being to be possible. So form is not itself ousia. Form is not itself a substance. It is a requirement of substance. Substance requires form in order to be. Fundamental entities, stuff of reality. This ends up playing a really big deal, especially later on in the 17th century and such, with Renaissance philosophy. So we'll be seeing a lot more about substance later on and what we mean by this. Now, what you might be wondering though, okay, so that accommodates being. What about the becoming part? What about becoming? How does Aristotle deal with the puppy problem, as I've called it? Let me get a little bit more concrete here. What we're going to need in order to understand this is Aristotle's idea of causality. So here are the four causes as they're typically reproduced when discussing Aristotle. Here we have, say, some bedside table, right? And this delightful little table here has four causes, and Aristotle says everything in the world does. At least everything in our world does. It has a material cause. It's made of something, primarily wood. You could say lacquer, throw a couple of other things in there, but you have the material. There's the material. We need material in order to create the table. We also need the form. We said that already. You can't have form without material. You can't have material without form. In this case, the form is going to be, well, the form of a table. It's going to look like a table, or even if it looks like a weird form of a table, you can still ultimately say it has the form of a table if it fits within the category well enough, if it maybe works well enough for that purpose. How about the efficient cause? What does that mean? An efficient cause here means, and it does something similar to what we say in mathematics, like a coefficient. Maybe you know that's a number that operates on a variable and then changes it or scales it or whatever it does. So an efficient cause is what brings about the going from one form to another form, what changes the material and such that at one moment this was a tree, that the next moment it's a table, right? In that case, you can say carpentry itself is the efficient cause. I would also argue the person doing it. We might call this in modern lingo a constructor, but we won't talk about modern stuff right now. This is not philosophy speak anyway. This is more other realms of mathematics. But carpentry, a carpenter, someone who makes tables. Imagine the wood sitting there for X number of years, hundreds of years, is never going to transform itself into a table. You have to have something that brings it about. As far as science goes, efficient cause is the closest or most scientific of these, right? In the sense that if science were to speak of a cause, then it would probably rely exclusively on the efficient cause, on the thing that is causing something to happen. And this is how we're constantly talking about what caused something to happen. A or B or C, event, person, thing caused that to happen. That's the efficient cause. Then we have this final one up here, the final cause. Now, up to this point, Aristotle drew these causes from different pre-Socratic philosophers. So he made a lot of commentary about, say, the Malaysians, those are like Thales and others, and saying, yes, material, remember water, fire, etc. Yes, that's right, material cause. There's definitely that material that is part of the things of our world. To say that all things are made of water may be meaningless, but to say that water makes some things in the world is not meaningless, right? Then he says, well, why formal cause? Well, formal cause harks back to, again, a little bit of Plato, a little bit of Parmenides, and so forth, that they were on the right track in talk and discussing form, but they went down, with Plato in particular, went down this path of eidos instead of the path of morphe. We need to talk about form as something inseparable from matter. So while he's sort of tipping his hat to these earlier philosophers, he's saying there's a better way to think about them. Think about this cause. The efficient cause was actually already touched on by others, such as Empedocles. Most specifically by Empedocles. Remember how Empedocles said that there are elements, there were multiple elements, and then there were four for him, and then there were also these forces, like love and strife, or these motives, or motive causes as he might have called them. That is, there's something that brings about some process, some thing that brings about the attraction and repulsion of these elements. That is an early form of the efficient cause, and so he takes that too. The final cause is Aristotle's own. He comes into his own here. He says, final cause, this is what has not been discussed nearly enough. We've already discussed the final cause, though, ourselves. We talked about it back in the mythology section when we were discussing the concept of teleology. Remember how deterministic thinking has me thinking in the direction of A causes B, causes C, causes D? And teleological thinking has something along the lines of a way of saying that D brings, causes C, and that it brings it into a being, brings it into being by way of purpose maybe, or C makes B purposeful by bringing B into causing B to happen, and so forth. It's hard. It's actually, if you've never tried before, it's hard to describe it in some ways, at least as easily and coherently as determinism. But this is Aristotle's idea here, that there's a final cause, that things are teleologically pulled into the future. Now, this is the farthest from what we think of in terms of modern science and scientific thinking. This is the farthest concept, the farthest cause from what we typically attribute to how things come about, is that, well, again, we could, easy enough to say, well, God caused it to happen. Or again, I stepped in the puzzle by way of principle. I stepped in the puddle because it prevented me from getting into a car crash. Or as Gaarder brings it up, he introduces it as, oranges and apples are brought into fruition for us to eat. If you say for something, or for the purpose of something, you might be delving into a little bit of that final cause mentality, of that teleological way of thinking. And this was Aristotle's way of explaining the puppy problem, of finding a sort of solution for the puppy problem. First of all, forms are not as Plato describes them. They are morphe as opposed to eidos, and more importantly, that they require material in order to come about. So as it were, if there's a sort of final form or a maturity form, then this is possible. We could say there's an immature form of the dog and there's a mature form of the dog. And what brings that about? Why does an immature dog or puppy always become a dog and not a hippo? Or why do human babies, grow into human beings and not chairs? He says because the final form, or the final cause, right? The final cause is the explanation. Because all things are meant to mature. They're being pulled into their mature form from, in a sense, a potential realm of being into an actualized realm of being. There's so much to say, and then this is what becoming is going from that potential to the actualized. There's so much more to say here that I'm going to have to leave out because there's really just not enough time to delve into all the specifics and the nuances of what this implies and how he explains this. But to see how radically big a departure this is from Plato is important. And yet you can see also how he has tried to incorporate Plato into his work. Logic. We can't say enough about logic, or what we owe to Aristotle for logic. We've talked up to this point regarding Aristotle about metaphysics. We haven't talked about epistemology, but we've talked about his ontology, his metaphysics. Now, logic. Logic, he contributed to the world of philosophy in that systematization, that talking about the world in terms of the metaphysics and the causes that we just described. He believed it was possible to talk about the world using logic in a way that we could derive certain things to be true or not true, particularly for the purposes of rhetoric. Again, if you don't remember, rhetoric is the art, if you will, of speaking. The way of talking about not just speaking itself, but forming arguments for things, making a point or progressing a side of a on one end or the other of a matter, and so forth. So logic can be used for this, and he developed what's called syllogistic logic, which is another way of saying sort of a deductive logic. So if A and B, then C. We're not going to go into too much of that at this time, but the logic that we use today has been so massively influenced, founded as it were even on his early work here, earlier in history that is, that it's really indispensable in understanding the history of logic itself. And now finally we come to his ethics, which is also possibly, in fact, even more relied upon by modern day philosophers, that is, contemporary philosophers today, than any of the rest of his philosophy. Although I will admit I am something of an Aristotelian myself, and I think that his metaphysics really deserves a lot of attention. But let's go to ethics for a moment. He develops a concept called virtue ethics. We can describe virtue ethics as a form of ethics that emphasizes the virtues or moral character. So notice it doesn't say emphasizes virtues, it emphasizes the virtues. This definition comes from SEP, that's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If you see SEP elsewhere in these slides, that's what that means. And so the virtues, he feels that we can actually name what the virtues are. You know, way back here, Socrates was saying, can we even teach virtues? Can we know what virtues are? Can we teach what virtues are? Or can we only come to know what virtues are by another means? A very important question, still not completely answered. Still very important to think about. But then Aristotle comes up to the podium saying, yes, virtues are known and understood, so let's go from there. Forget about the ability to teach them directly. What about the indirect imparting of ethics or virtues to other people? That is his ethics. What does that mean? Well, I want you to imagine for a second, pause the video or just take a moment to think about this. Is there somebody in your life, someone to whom maybe your whole family or your whole community think of first and foremost whenever anybody brings up, oh, what would so-and-so do? You know, remember, I don't know if you ever got to see, we back in the day, they used to have these wristbands with the WWJD. What would Jesus do, right? That question, just replace the Jesus with a blank and ask yourself that question. What would so-and-so do? When you're in a pickle, when you are facing dire moral straits, trying to choose between right and wrong in a very important decision to you, who would you put in that blank? Who do you maybe think about? Most of us maybe in the modern day don't have heroes as much anymore. You know, a lot of us tend to practically worship popular media figures without actually having any true heroes to admire. Most of those figures probably do things that we don't want to have emulated in our lives. But forget that judgment, that moral judgment for a moment, and just think, if there's someone you know in your life personally, maybe it's a brother or a sister, maybe it's one of your parents, maybe it's someone, if you go to a church, maybe it's someone in your church community, if you go to a synagogue or a Buddhist temple, someone in those communities, if you're not religious at all, and you simply are part of an educational community, or you've got a group of best friends, who in that group would you trust to make the best moral decisions, the best choice of what's right or wrong? It may be yourself, although we have to be really careful about that, because maybe that's part of our trouble. Maybe this is part of why virtue ethics is really hard to hone in on in the world today, is because we all think ourselves the best decision makers. But I doubt that that's going to be true across the board. I think most of us will think of somebody that if we were struggling with something, we would want to call up on the phone and say, hey, I've got this problem. I'm wondering if you could give some thought, some reflection on what would be the right thing to do here. That person for Aristotle is the center virtue ethical character that is needed for virtue ethics to do what it does, which is a natural form. One thing that's really different between Aristotle and Plato, again, is compared to before, Plato is very abstract, thinking about what is beyond the world, and Aristotle is very experience-oriented, empirical. Let's talk about what we can observe and actually see happening in the world. And their ethics sort of reflect that too. Plato comes up with things like the tripartite. Maybe, again, that was Socrates, but if it was, Plato sure seems to have run with it. And, this is based on the ideal three-part system of the body and the ideal three-part system of occupation and therefore society and so forth. So Aristotle doesn't go there. He says, like most things, that there's there's a natural strata. There's there's the world itself and how it already operates. If Plato is kind of like, this is how things should be, Aristotle is much more on the side of, this is how things are. And we can just observe and recognize that, and maybe that will help us decide what we should and shouldn't do. So virtue ethics is not an ethics of what one should do. It's more of and that is, it's not so much a prescription of what one should do. It's more of a description of how the world actually works, according to Aristotle. That some people embody these principles, these virtues specifically, not even so much principles as virtues of courage, of wisdom, intelligence, etc., of wealth. He does believe that it is more likely for a person to become a good human being if they have health and wealth and wisdom, to refrain something that's come up a lot recently. I think it was Benjamin Franklin's quote. Without these things, you just don't have the right material. You don't have the right conditions to become the kind of person that can do, not just think about, but actually do the right thing. To have the education to understand right versus wrong, and to have the education to know the facts so that you can make good moral decisions that aren't just based on what's emotionally pulling you in the moment. The most important, vital thing for a human being is to become happy, is what Aristotle would say. Happiness, in some sense, a Greek form of happiness, is the most important thing. If we mature into full human beings, we only do so not just by what we look like, by growing beards, by growing breasts if we're women, and so forth. It's not just a biological thing. It's also what happens when we learn about and start to move toward the concept of happiness. When happiness is the final cause for human beings, says Aristotle, to which you can from which you can derive all other purposes, all other reasons for doing something. Another quick exercise. Why are you taking this course? Why are you watching this video right now? What's your reason for it? You can pause the video and think about this, but I'll give you some common ones I hear. Oh, I really want to know more about philosophy. I'm really interested in thinking differently from those around me, being a unique thinker. I've heard this is really good for my grades. Things like that. Okay, all three of those are reasons. But all three of those, and probably, according to Aristotle, any other reasons you could come up with, right? Those are all going to have deeper reasons. Well, I'm really interested in philosophical thinking or being a unique thinker, maybe because I really want to stand out. Maybe I want to be proud of myself. Okay? If I'm doing this because I want to make good grades, again, maybe I want to be proud of myself, or maybe I want others to be proud of me, or maybe I want to get into a good school so I can get a good job, so I can make good money. But what's, again, the deepest purpose to all of those things, to all of those reasons? Happiness. I want to be proud of myself. I want people to be proud of me. I want to make good money, or I want to have a good job, or I want to be happy with life because, happiness. Happy with life, again, even. Happiness. Happiness is, for him, the final cause for human beings. It is the explanation to all we do. And when somebody becomes that best version of a human being, it is not happiness, by pleasure seeking and getting everything you wanted and all that stuff. For him, happiness comes about when we're able to discover, wisdom. And so when that person can be a role model for others, because we recognize, they do things for the right reasons. They are willing to suffer in places where it's important maybe to suffer to do the right thing. Those are the people that we want to at least if not emulate, then think about and ask, what would they do? This is virtue ethics for him. Now, how are these how do we determine what these virtues are? There's this idea of the golden mean, and I don't really like the term very much, but we're going to use it. Gaarder uses it, I think, too. The golden mean does not refer to this. Talk about mathematics. It is not referring to this other idea of the golden mean, which is a very specific concept having to do with the transcendental number phi and all these other things. We're going to get past this now. Let's talk about the golden mean as it applies to Aristotle's virtue ethics. There it is, right there in the middle. That's the golden mean. So taking courage as an example here. Let's say this is Bob. Bob runs away in the face of danger. Aristotle might say Bob has a severe lack of courage, an extreme lack of courage, a deficiency in courage. Meanwhile, we've got, I don't know, Joe over here and Joe Bob. Joe has the opposite problem. He goes straight into the heart of battle, no plan. It's a terrific meme, and it's a great example of this over here. Excess of courage or recklessness. So what someone like Aristotle might say, although I have some contentions with this, what might say is that you want to find this, not just balance. The word balance is not a good version here, but you want to find where there is not an excess or a deficiency, but enoughness of courage so that you make the right decisions. Now, I thought you said, Kelsey, that this wasn't prescriptive, so I am supposed to do something. Well, not quite, because the idea here is not that I nor anyone else should be able to tell you where to find this mean. Not I nor anyone else can teach you where it is between deficiency and excess that courage as a virtue lies, so that in the right situation you do the right thing. Because it's different for every person, it's different for every situation, and every person's going to have less or more sensitivity to those things, to those conditions, and to themselves in order to appropriately gauge how much courage there is. So in other words, it's more like learning how to play the violin than it is learning a set of rules like a 10 Commandments or something of what to do. Learning to play the violin requires you can sit there and conceptualize it as much as you want, read as many books on violin or riding a bike for that matter, but until you actually do it, you will not be able to learn to do it. You have to acquire this over time by way of habit, another important concept of Aristotle's. And by way of habit, given enough time, given enough resources, given enough of the right conditions and opportunities, you will learn what virtue is, what courage is, what love is, but you will only be able to discover it for yourself. Nobody can learn violin for you, and nobody can impart to you directly what that virtue is. Virtue ethics is one of three forms of ethics in this blanket category of what we call normative ethics. And I don't want to go into the weeds here either, but since ethics is what, unlike myself, the majority of people find ethics to be the most appealing and interesting. So I want to be sure that we get the right picture about this. Normative ethics are ethics of essentially what to do. They include, to some extent, some prescription, and they can be descriptive. But normative ethics, as it were, has three main branches or categories, and we're not going to get into them all today, but deontology is one, consequentialism is another big one, and virtue ethics is a third. But keep in mind that of the three, virtue ethics, while it's actually undergoing a little bit of a popularity revival again, it's the one least emphasized through most of the history of philosophy. With that, we will see you again for the next lesson when we talk about the Hellenistic philosophers.